Real stories of werewolves, of dogmen from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Werewolf ate my sister. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am an old man who only recently discovered your channel. For the most part, I find it highly entertaining. I don't believe most of the stories people send you, and in fact I think some of them must be hoaxes or pranks being pulled on you. But I do believe in the dogman, and so I think some of your stories might have some validity to them. I have a dogman narrative for you about someone who tried to make friends with one of the creatures, but found out it was a bad idea. Don't worry, the story is not violent, or at least if it is, the violence all takes place off screen. You see, in my opinion, the werewolf in this story ate my sister. This is a tale from when I was 13 or 14, and my older sister was 17, and engaged to be married to a guy we can call Brad. Let's call my sister Janet, because that is what the two of them looked like back in those days. Brad and Janet, from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. This was the early 1960s, so I'm not even exaggerating. He wore bow ties and had thick black framed glasses. She wore long skirts and got an A in home economics class. They were the perfect Midwestern couple in 1962. But there was trouble in paradise after the day my family had a fun picnic day in the Michigan woods behind our home, and Janet met the dogman. Well, let me be very clear. I should not say they met that day, but that was the first time she saw him. We all saw him. Even my conservative button-down dad, who was a junior executive at a major auto manufacturer in Detroit, he saw the dogman on that day too. And we got a clear look, since the sun had not yet set when it happened. I remember it like it happened an hour ago, so I'll tell you the story. I've told it a million times. There was a field in the middle of the woods behind us that we called the picnic field. Growing up, I thought it was named that officially. I was surprised when I couldn't find it called that on a map of the town at Town Hall. That was just our family's name for it, since my parents had been having picnics back there, going back to before they even had either of us kids. But they never saw any cryptids until that day that we all did. Janet saw it first. She had wanted to invite her fiancé Brad along, but Dad said this was a family picnic, so he wasn't invited. As a consequence, Janet was pouting and staying further away from the rest of us than usual. She wanted to make sure that we knew she was missing Brad, and that it was all Dad's fault. You know, teenager stuff. I got into some of that myself a few years afterward. Setting the scene before the sighting, Janet was off in the field walking around and avoiding her family, and I was midway between her and our parents, tossing a ball up in the air and catching it. The next thing I knew, Janet had run up to me and was whispering in my ear. At first all I could make out was psst, 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 but I looked where she was pointing, and then I saw it too. There was this big, dark, shirtless guy standing over there in the high grass and bushes. Only he wasn't a guy. He was some kind of an animal. But he stood like a guy, if that makes sense. I first registered his face as a monster face, more than a dog face, although it did have pointed dog ears up on top that reminded me of devil horns. His eyes also glowed like a demon's eyes, and I screamed out loud before I even knew what I was doing. That alerted Mom and Dad that something was going on. From the sounds emanating from their direction, I got the impression they saw the monster as well. I'm going to try to describe exactly what we were seeing. I mean, it wasn't like it was some guy exposing himself, because we couldn't see his kibbles and bits down there. He was dark and he was covered in dark fur, so it was a double whammy in terms of discerning too much detail. But we could make out his silhouetted form very clearly, and we could see his eyes glowing like electrical light bulbs in a Christmas display. I would say a Halloween display, but I had never seen one of those yet in those days. The eyes were sort of orange, so I guess Halloween is a better comparison than Christmas. At any rate, Janet and I just froze and looked at this creature. It was in good shape, and it was taller than my dad. Then I heard and felt my parents running up behind me, and the creature shambled off into the woods and disappeared. I noticed that when he turned to depart, Janet took a step or two running after him, then seemed to think better of it. Mom grabbed me and Dad grabbed Janet, ushering us back to the picnic area and away from where our family just had their first ever cryptid encounter. From that point forward, Janet was in the backwoods nearly every single day. Sometimes she would bring one or two of her girlfriends with her. Sometimes she would just go alone. Brad would come calling for her, and we would have to tell him that she was in the backwoods somewhere, though we had no idea where. That was long before cell phones, so when someone went into the woods in those days, they might as well have gone to the moon. You weren't going to talk to them again until they got back. It was during this period that Brad and I got to be friendly. He would come over and sit around our house waiting for his fiancée to come home from the forest. We would play card games like Go Fish, and sometimes we would talk about cool stuff like Mickey Mantle. Eventually I mentioned the dog-headed wolfman that lived out back, and Brad got very interested. It turned out that my sister had never mentioned the wolfman to her own boyfriend. I found that bizarre, since I assumed that was probably the reason that she was spending so much time back there. She was most likely trying to get a second chance to see that monster dog that walked like a man. Brad stared at me wide-eyed, letting it all sink in. Then his face grew angry, and he accused me of making up lies to get him even more upset than he already was. He thought I was taunting him, since he missed my sister so much. I told him to ask my mother if he didn't believe me, and so he did. Poor guy. It must be hard to accept that your girlfriend likes monsters more than she likes you. I offered to go search for her with him. Maybe we could find out what she was really doing back there, and then nobody would have to guess any longer. Brad didn't really want to agree to this, but the next time he showed up and Janet was AWOL again, he grabbed me and told me to guide him through those woods in the back. We went to the picnic area first, and as we got close, it sounded like someone was saying something. We got quiet and crept closer, listening intently. As we reached the edge of the woodline surrounding the picnic field, we could see my sister on the other side of the grass, facing away from us. We could hear that she was talking to someone, but we couldn't hear what she was saying, or see who she was talking to. It looked like she was speaking into a black void of shadows, nothing more. As we moved as close as we dared to go in order to see better what was happening, a large figure moved forward out of the shadows to stand directly in front of Janet. It was a dogman or werewolf, but it was even larger than the one we had seen last time. This was the Big Daddy Alpha werewolf, if you ask me. As it moved toward Janet, her fiancé Brad screamed out, "Get away from my girlfriend, you monster!" And he ran forward across the picnic area. I ran too, just so that I wouldn't miss any of the action. The dogman was already gone before I even got back to look in that direction, and Janet was marching angrily toward Brad. He gestured like he was going to hug her, relieved that she was safe. But Janet avoided his hug and began lecturing him that he frightened the animal away. Brad agreed. He had frightened the animal away because it was heading toward Janet. But there was no reasoning with her. I thought Brad had saved her life, but Janet seemed to think that Brad had done something terribly rude. Can you imagine? So right in front of me, the two of them had a big fight. Brad and I returned to my home and told my parents what was going on with Janet in those backwoods. My dad never liked any of my sister's boyfriends, so just because Brad had said Janet was in trouble, Dad decided she was fine. If I had come back alone and told Dad that my sister was hanging with a monster behind the house, he'd have flipped his wig. But if it meant prying her away from one of her boyfriends, well then, suddenly Dad was defending her right to go be in the woods all the time. Dad was a man with priorities. As far as Mom went, she always agreed with my father. She did everything he said to do slavishly. Like, you know how modern women tend to obey the Democratic Party? Well, back then, women would tend to do what their husbands wanted as their default programming. That was my mom. If you asked her opinion on something, she would look to my father and wait for him to answer. So if Dad said Janet was fine out back in the woods alone as it was getting dark, when we had all seen a man-sized dog-headed monster or two back out there, then by gum, Janet was fine out back in the woods alone as it got dark with multiple dogmen, each larger than my dad. Brad's every argument was defeated, and he walked home, tail between his legs. Dad drank a beer to celebrate. Janet, no longer encumbered by a fiancé or social life, began to spend even more time out back, to the point where Mom and I started to get worried about her. With my mother, worrying came naturally. With me, I was deeply offended to be having feelings of care and worry over my stupid sister. Those were feelings you should strictly reserve for your pet dog or maybe tarantula, but not your idiotic sister. So I wanted her to stop placing herself in danger back there. I had seen 2 of those dogmen and I was into monsters. If I was too scared to hang out back there, what business did she have? She was a girl. She wasn't even supposed to like monsters. I found the whole thing so annoying and confusing, I'll be honest. And I wanted it fixed. Corrected. I wanted a return to some kind of normalcy. I started to go looking for my sister in the woods each day when I got home from school. She was usually somewhere near the picnic area, and she was usually talking to a dogman. Now, I don't know if they understood her, and I was too far away to hear what she was saying. I would just find her, then get comfortable in a spot where I could do my homework, and sort of keep an eye on her. The dogman never seemed to do anything but stare at her with a strange expression on his face. I still have no clue what emotion he was expressing, but the creature seemed uncomfortable somehow. Stressed out, to use modern terminology. He was fidgety. He would shift from foot to foot. Sometimes he seemed nervous. Other times he seemed quite agitated. There were a number of occasions where I thought the beast was about to bite my sister, but she never seemed to notice his sharp attitude shifts. She seemed to think she was friends with at least the one werewolf. Sometimes I would see 2 of them, and she would seem to talk calmly to both. Did she think these were big stuffed teddy bears? These were large wild animals. They could make a snack out of her. She wouldn't even fill them up. For all I know, that was what they wanted to do. Maybe she just had them temporarily confused because she kept chatting them up. And maybe it was just a matter of time before one of them did something terrible to her. That seemed more likely to me than the idea of things remaining calm forever. I decided to go to both my parents with what I'd been seeing. Instead of insisting that we should do something, I figured I should tell Dad I was confused, and then give him all the details and ask him to tell me what I should do. When I explained that I felt Janet was placing herself in danger by being so close to these predatory dog bears, Dad finally had a new context to view the situation from. He now realized his daughter was in danger, and so he put on his tennis shoes, and he asked me to lead him back through the woods and show him where Janet was. Well, we marched back to the picnic area, but we couldn't see her or anybody else there on that evening. Dad asked me to take him to the second most likely spot she might be in, and the third and the fourth, and so on. The more we looked, the more Dad was huffing and puffing and getting out of breath. I was starting to worry he might give himself an attack, so I talked him into giving up the search. I told him Janet was probably home eating dinner, which we were going to miss. He laughed and agreed, and we headed back, but there was no Janet to be seen when we got back there. This wasn't the first time she had missed dinner, especially lately, but this was the first time it really bothered all 3 of us. When she hadn't returned by the next morning, Dad gathered some men to go search the woods for Janet, and I walked over to Brad's place to see if he wanted to join in the search. I found out he had a new girlfriend, and the new girl would likely get jealous if he went searching for the prior one. I understood why he begged off, and I couldn't really blame him. We ended up about 18 men strong, or 17 men and 14-year-old me, and we scoured those woods for hours. At one point, my father and I, along with I guess 2 of the other men, all saw one of the dogmen. It was a pretty intense moment, too. Remember, this was the morning, and it was a bright, sunny day. The woods were pretty quiet, but in a quiet morning kind of way, not a spooky way. You could hear morning birds, crickets, and all that. But the mood was mellow and quiet. We were advancing in a straight line, keeping each other in our line of vision as we progressed forward. There were trees, there were bushes, but there was no Janet. And then suddenly out of nowhere, one of the dogmen, looking so dark that he almost appeared like a shadow creature even in the morning light, stood up from behind the bush he had been hiding behind and ran away at lightning speed into some other part of the woods. My father screamed. I screamed. At least 2 other guys screamed. Not a single one of us ran after it. When it stood up, there was a bit of a surreal clown car kind of an effect. How had such a tall creature managed to hide himself behind such a tiny little bush? And secondly, how could a 2-legged creature run away at such a remarkable speed? The way I remember it, we went straight home after that and Dad called the police. So this doesn't have a happy ending. Things didn't turn out well on this story. Janet never did come home. Dad blamed himself and went a little nuts. He lost his job, we lost our home, but Mom and Dad never got divorced. They just got crazier and crazier together. They each became each other's worst influence. It got harder and harder to see them as the years progressed. As I got older, they stayed back in 1962. They never stopped talking about finding Janet. On what would have been her 60th birthday, they posted on Facebook that they had some new clues in her disappearance. Did they really? I didn't even read the details. The whole thing was kind of messed up. I have friended Brad on social media. He is still alive. He says that Janet left him to go become the bride of Tarzan. He says those were not dogmen. Those were werewolves. And he thinks Janet picked a rich werewolf to marry. He's convinced that's the real, true, secret explanation for what happened to my sister. But I don't know if I can get behind that theory. It doesn't seem too realistic for me. I do believe in dogman, as I've said, but I don't think I believe in shapeshifters or humans that turn into werewolves. Nah, if you ask me, that was a dogman. Or a real werewolf. And I think that werewolf ate my sister. This executive producer is not the samer. Our new EP is the Wolf Boy Gamer. Please join me in welcoming our newest executive producer, the Wolf Boy Gamer, who made this episode possible. He now gets to see our secret uncensored dogman shows far too wild to show on this channel. Here to explain how you can see them too is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.